Good afternoon. My name is Karen Cotton, and welcome to the Research and Innovation Training Institute Grant Writing Workshop. We thank you for joining us today, and we are excited about the offerings that we have for you. To tell us more about that, may I introduce Dr. Shonda Green.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. This is our third in our series with Miss Lucy Deckard. And we are very excited to have her here today to talk about a topic that actually we don't often get an opportunity to discuss regarding graduate students. So we're very excited. We thank you for attending and go ahead and take it over, Lucy.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. As you probably got the message, we're also recording this. So if you have some grad students who you think later might benefit from this, feel free to share with them, or some undergrads who are thinking about going to grad school is also a good audience for what we're going to talk about today. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so our topic for this this next hour is going to be on graduate fellowships, and since I'm talking to faculty, what I'm going to talk about is both what's out there, but also how you can mentor your students to help to make them aware of what's out there for them, and if they're considering going to graduate school, if they're already in graduate school and looking for some support. There are a lot of things out there, but it is helpful. In fact, it's really critical that they have guidance from faculty, their mentors, because it's really hard for a student to figure all this out on their own. And so hopefully this will be a resource for you when you're in that situation, when you're mentoring students. I have a lot of slides that are really mainly resources, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And if you go to the chat, you'll find a link to download all these slides. So there's a lot of links because they're linking to a lot of different graduate fellowship programs. So as I said, I'll kind of skip over them. You can download them and then share them or use them as you find helpful as you're trying to mentor your students. Okay, so everybody should be seeing my slides. So if you're not, please let me know right now. So as I said, not only do I have the slides up here at this link, the Dropbox link, but also some successful examples of fellowship application essays and so forth that might be helpful for you to share with your students. This is just our website. So I'm a consultant. I work for Academic Research Funding Strategies. So if you want to know more about us, this is the link for that. Most important thing here is my email address. So if you do have any questions later, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to answer questions. So what we're going to cover in the next hour, we're going to talk about kind of what types and kind of categories of fellowships are out there. I think it helps to kind of make sense of all the stuff if you just Google graduate fellowships, you're going to come up with all kinds of stuff. So it helps to kind of know the categories so you can guide your students to the ones that are appropriate for them. Then we'll talk a little bit about why bother. Why should a student bother to get a fellowship, particularly if maybe they already can get a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship, but also why should you as a faculty member bother to encourage your students to apply for fellowships? Then I'm going to go kind of through the various kind of fellowships that are out there, how to find those, how to understand really quickly if your student is eligible for the one that you're looking at, if it's appropriate for them. And then I'm going to talk about some examples, just quickly to kind of make it a little more concrete. What is it they're asking for? What kind of advice do you need to give your students, and how to guide them in preparing strong applications? As we go through this, there's not a whole lot of us, so feel free to just jump in and unmute yourself and ask questions, or if you'd rather, you can always type your question in the chat. Okay, so let's step back a little bit and talk about, okay, what type of fellowships are out there, and in fact, what is a fellowship? Okay, so a fellowship is a program where they provide a stipend for the student. So this is not about funding a research project in which, you're paying for the cost of doing the project, you're paying for materials and supplies and so forth. This is about funding, kind of giving support to the students so they can live while they're going to graduate school. A lot of graduate fellowships also will provide some extra money to cover cost of education, like tuition and so forth. But most of it is all about the stipend that the students get. Okay, so when you're looking at funding for graduate students, you have they can go for research assistantship. So basically what that is they're getting funded. Again, they're getting almost like a salary to pay for their time, and they're doing research as part of their advisor or a faculty member's project that usually is funded by a grant. So basically that faculty member wrote up a proposal for a particular research project. They put in money for a graduate student to help do the work, and that's how that graduate student is getting funded. Okay. They're also teaching assistantship. So in that case, it's like a job. The graduate student is getting paid to help teach or grade or run labs, that kind of thing. It's usually funded by the department. Okay. And then there are graduate fellowships. Okay, so those are really different in that you are not being required to basically do a job. You're just being required to go to graduate school. There may be some other things, and we'll talk about that. Other expectations, for example, maybe doing an internship at a company that's funding a fellowship, that kind of thing. But in general, this is all about just supporting the student as they go to graduate school. Okay, when you're looking at the types of graduate fellowships out there, there's kind of a lot of them are sort of tied to where the student is in their career. Okay, and the types of fellowships that are available and the disciplines that they support really also tend to be tied to some extent to where they are in their career, because this is really related to the motivation of the funder. Okay, so when you're looking at a student's career, they may be kind of finishing up their undergrad and trying to decide, do I want to go to grad school? Do I want to go work in industry? Okay, in which case, there are some graduate fellowships that are really all about encouraging those students not to go off to industry, to go to graduate school. Okay, and so they will fund, that kind of they'll accept applications from senior undergrads or students who are very early in their graduate careers, and then they will fund them for some portion of their graduate studies. Okay, these kinds of fellowships tend to be more in STEM areas. Okay, and the reason for that is those are the kinds of students that tend to have to decide, do I want to go into industry? I'm an engineer, I'm a scientist. Do I want to go into to industry, or do I want to stay and pursue a research career? So particularly National Science Foundation, some of the other Department of Defense, a lot of them, they are really invested in trying to get more students to go into STEM research. And that's why they fund these kinds of graduate fellowships. Okay. There are also, though, times when a student has finished, they've been in graduate school for a while, they've been taking classes, they finished their classes, they're starting to work on their dissertation. Okay, and a lot of times, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, this is where you start to lose students. You have students who've made it this far, and then they just don't get that dissertation written. And a lot of times they end up being with ABD, right? All but dissertation, and dropping out. Okay, so this is a big concern of funders who want to support scholars who are in social sciences and humanities. And so you see a lot of dissertation grants, and what they are is basically you are eligible right as you're finishing classes, ready to start writing your dissertation. Those are the kinds of students that can apply for dissertation grants, and then they'll fund you going forward. Okay. And then there are generic fellowships. Some of these are much more focused on other things, for example, broadening participation, enhancing diversity, or just encouraging more students to get PhDs in chemistry or serial science or whatever the interest of the funder is. A lot of times it might be a professional association, in which case, they might fund at various times. They might be more open to when you might be eligible, and then fund a student through their graduate careers. Okay, so importantly, these kinds of fellowships, they vary a lot in what is expected based on the type of fellowship. So usually when you're talking about a student who might be a senior undergrad going to grad school and asking for funding to do, to kind of start off in grad school, the complexity of the fellowship is a lot lower, because they really haven't not gotten that far yet, than if you're talking about somebody who is farther along. So the farther along you get, the more complex the application is, and to the point where you get to some of these fellowships that are really for folks who are kind of closer to finishing their graduate careers, they sometimes have to write almost a full kind of research proposal, because it's expected they have a much better handle on what they're going to do in their research. They've already really started it. And so this means that, again, there's a kind of a lot of differences, a lot of diversity in the expectations for different kinds of fellowships. All right, so now let's look at the types of fellowships in terms of, who can apply and what they're for. So you have awards that are directly to students, okay? And these are basically individual fellowships. So a student might just apply on their own, or sometimes they will apply through the university, maybe in tandem with a mentor. But it really is just about that student, and that student is going to be judged. Their application is going to be judged as an individual against the other individuals who apply. Okay. Often these kinds of fellowships are portable. So a student, particularly if they're early in their career, maybe they haven't even quite decided yet which graduate program they're going to go to, they a lot of times will have a lot of leeway and decide where they're going to go. And if they decide to go one place and then move, they can take their fellowship with them. Okay, so examples of this: NSF Graduate Research Fellowships, National Defense Fellowships, Ford Foundation Fellowships, Humane Studies Fellowships, and a bunch of other ones are that way. So that's what we're really going to talk about more. There are also, though, institutional awards. So these are awards that, for example, peer review would write a proposal for and say, hey, we want, to support 15 students a year who are going to get this kind of a PhD or a master's degree. We have a program that we're going to describe to you. This is how we're going to mentor them. And then the funder will give that money to the institution to peer review. The peer review will then recruit those students who are going to get those fellowships. Okay, so that is more, these are more institutional, and they are a lot of times kind of larger multi-million-dollar programs when you're talking about that many fellowships. So examples would be Department of Education has their graduate assistantships in areas of national need. NSF has a number of these national research traineeships, Alliances for Graduate Education Professoriate. NIH has training grants like the T32. So these are kind of grants that, again, the peer review would apply for, or another institution might apply for. The reason I mention this is sometimes if a student is going to a particular institution, they will sometimes see these advertised as, they're going to a particular department, and that department says, hey, we have a program, where you can apply to get a fellowship. Those are absolutely fine. I'm not going to talk about them because they're very specific to different institutions, but certainly those are things to encourage your students to look for, particularly if you're, say, mentoring an undergrad who's going to go somewhere else for graduate school. They may not be aware of what's out there at that other school. So definitely, ask them to check and see if they might have some, some institutional fellowships that they might be eligible for. Okay, but in general, we're going to talk about here are national fellowships, meaning anybody in the country can apply. So they're not institution specific. Okay, so why should both your student and you, bother to write these applications for fellowships, particularly if you're in a field where you're going to get a research assistantship or you can get a TA anyway and get funded? Okay, so there are a number of reasons. One is it's just a guaranteed source of funding, right? So if a student wins one of these, they know they've got funding for a number of years. Whereas if you're, for example, looking for a research assistantship, it just depends on if your advisor has money or if you can find somebody who's willing to hire you to work on their project. So, same thing with TAs. TAs might be available one year and not available another year. So this is a much more steady source of funding. The stipends often are much higher than what, for example, a research assistantship would pay. Now, that's not always the case. So we will talk about kind of these more professional associations. Their fellowships tend to be much smaller. But for the big national fellowships like the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, they pay $34,000 a year in stipends, okay, plus more money to cover tuition and so forth. So they are definitely more lucrative than most TAs or RAs. Okay, they can be a path to a job for a student. So Department of Energy, for example, they fund fellowships where they want students to do some of their work at a national lab facility. Well, obviously, part of that is they want to get to know them, and maybe they'll hire them to work at the national lab. Same thing for a number of companies that, either as part of an association or consortium, they fund graduate fellowships, or just on their own. They might, particularly big corporations, sometimes will fund fellowships. And this is all a lot of times part of kind of training their own workforce. So it can be a great way to make connections. Okay. Now, for you as a faculty member, if you're mentoring students, obviously, if you have a student who's going to be a graduate student working for you, it's obvious what you get out of it. You get support for your student. You don't have to try to support them through your grant funding. But also, it can be a real kind of way to encourage excellence in your department. So even if you're talking about, say, mentoring undergrads who might even be going somewhere else for graduate school, or they may be staying at Prairie View for graduate school, they set a standard. Basically, when students see other students winning fellowships, they start to say, oh, this isn't interesting, maybe I want to apply. And they see it's it's possible. They see the perks of doing that. And it just raises the bar for all your students, and they, get to be better known. And of course, they also really develop their skills, their writing skills, their ability to understand, and frame their research. So it is a really good teaching tool. Even if they don't get funded, having them go through this, having them mentor each other in writing applications is a great way for them to kind of learn how to write in a scholarly way, how to frame their research, how to kind of determine really how would you describe your research to somebody who's not right in your area. And so that is a really wonderful experience, and education experience. And as I said earlier, as students start to win, they start to mentor each other, and it starts to become much more of an expectation. And so it can really raise the level of excellence in your department. Okay. All right, so let's talk about finding potential fellowships. Okay, it can be a little bit daunting to figure out, what's out there. Of course, as somebody in your field, as a scholar in your field, it's always important for you to kind of, you'll know who the funders are in your field, and definitely you want to look to see, with those funders, are they funding graduate fellowships? And many times they are. Okay, so if you are, for example, doing research in Department of Defense kind of related areas, if you have people in your department who are funded by Department of Defense, then a lot of times that might be a good place for students in your department to be applying. But there's also, there's NSF funds them, NASA funds them, NIH, EPA, National Endowment for the Humanities, USDA, Department of Ed, Department of Homeland Security. There are lots of different federal agencies that fund fellowships. There are private foundations, professional organizations, corporations. Okay, and then, as I said before, they fund them for different stages, and early graduate training, dissertation grants, and then really pre-doctoral, and then of course postdoctoral. Okay, so basically, as a faculty mentor, it's a good idea to become familiar with the fellowships that are available for students in your field. And if you probably may already know some, you can a lot of times talk to your colleagues. You can see what folks, a lot of times the younger faculty, if they're coming up, they may have been funded on a fellowship. You can find out what those are. So a lot of times you can develop sort of naturally an understanding of what the pool of potential fellowships are. But there are also maybe some other ones that you may not be as aware of. And so it doesn't hurt to do a little bit of digging. And I'm going to try to give you some resources that you can give your students also to help them, to search for fellowships. I think it is important to keep an open mind. Sometimes you might be surprised at what, funders will fund. So for example, both NIH and NSF fund research in social and behavioral sciences, and they fund fellowships in those areas in ethics that's related to philosophy, communication, fields that maybe you might not think are really NIH or NSF related areas. So you kind of may want to look at that and say, okay, well, this student, what are they doing in terms of their graduate studies? Maybe they will fit one of those fellowships. Department of Defense funds cognitive, neural, and behavioral sciences. So again, it may not be an obvious fit, but that's something that is of interest to them. And then, of course, there are a lot of large fellowship programs and smaller targeted programs that really focus on diversity. Okay, so it may either be there are fellowships that are just specifically for diversity, okay, or there are fellowships that's one of the criteria. In most fellowships, they're looking for broadening participation and diversity. So being at an HBCU where you have a lot of students who are African American, Hispanic, that's a really great opportunity for those students. They're a lot of times going to be eligible for a lot of fellowships that that are particularly focused on diversity. And again, this is something a lot of times students aren't aware of, and this is where your role as a mentor can really make a huge difference. Is to point this out to the students. Look, did you know you're eligible for X fellowship? You know, maybe you should want to try applying for Y fellowship, because it's just a lot of times not on the radar of students, particularly if they're undergrads. We're kind of deciding, am I going to go to graduate school? They might not even be aware that they won't have to pay for graduate school. A lot of times, you know, they just assume it's going to be like undergrad. They've got to pay you know, tuitions, but in a lot of fields, they're going to get support. And so they a lot of times will only know that if you tell them and encourage them to apply for fellowships. So there are a lot of great web sources available to help find fellowships. Okay, and I'm not saying that you need to do all this work on your own, but definitely you can guide your students to look for some of these. Okay, so there are a couple of types of sites that are super helpful for finding fellowships. Okay, first is kind of compendia of data or databases of fellowships. So universities, there's certain universities that do a really good job of doing this, where they just collect those and they have them searchable, that you can filter them by, you know, what stage of training you're in or what your discipline is. So these are just a couple, and these are links. And again, as I mentioned, you can download these slides and then these links will be active. So UCLA, their graduate education office, has a really nice website and it's searchable for graduate fellowships. NC State has another one, and there are a bunch of other ones. And then even within a discipline, sometimes you'll find certain departments are really good. So for example, anthropology, you know, there's certain universities that have their Department of Anthropology keeps a great website, which is Compendia of Fellowships. So as you start to kind of look around, you a lot of times will find good resources for your particular discipline. And so you want to point your students to those. Okay, so then you have specific agencies and fellowship sites. So for example, NSF, they have a whole big, you know, kind of a search, you know, tool. And so this link takes you to a search tool for funding where you just click on graduate funding, and then you can find all of the graduate student funding that National Science Foundation funds. Same thing, Ford Foundation, they have multiple fellowships and you can find all that by going to their website. NIH has what they call the F kiosk. So F stands for fellowship, and you can go in and you can click on that, and it will tell you all the different kinds of fellowships that are available depending on the situation, you know, where that student is in their career and so forth. Okay. So let's just talk about some example national fellowships, and then I'll go into, you know, more detail about a couple of them. So I think one of the biggest ones that's available, the biggest programs in terms of the number of fellowships funded, is the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program, and I will go into much more detail about that one. That one funds STEM students going to graduate school. It's one of those early career ones, so it's either a senior in undergrad or early in their graduate careers. So, you know, again, it's the whole idea is to kind of encourage them to go into graduate school rather than going to industry. And they fund $2,000 a year. So this one definitely, if you're in STEM field, encourage your students to look into this. You know, these are going to be, for any of these, you know, the students have to have a pretty good GPA. It doesn't have to be a 4.0, but they do need to have a pretty good GPA to be competitive. So I would say focus on those students, you know, who have a pretty good GPA, plan or are considering going to graduate school. Point them in that direction if they're in a department or in a major that really aligns with what NSF is interested in. Ford Foundation, they have their pre-doctoral fellowships. These are particularly for students who are interested in going into academia. And they're all about broadening participation and diversifying the academia, the professoriate. So that can be a really great fit for those of your students who might be interested in doing that. NASA, Department of Defense, NIH, you can see they have a lot of variation in how many. So maybe 60 Ford Foundation predoctorals, 200 DOD ones, NIH around 600. So you can see it varies a lot by how big these are. And so again, you have to kind of get to know which ones fit your particular students. And then, as I said, there are a number of fellowships to promote diversity. I'm just linking some here, and I'll let you look at these later. Fellowships for women, fellowships for international students. Okay, so this is a little bit of a challenge. If you have graduate students who are international students, meaning they are not, they don't have a green card, they're not permanent residents, they're not citizens, they are unlikely to be eligible for U.S. government, federally funded fellowships. And why is that? It's always helpful to look at why is it the funder is funding something. The funder, in this case, the federal government, is funding fellowships because they want more people to get PhDs and graduate degrees, MS and PhDs in the particular field of interest. Okay, usually mostly STEM fields, not all, but mostly STEM fields. Okay, well, they want them to do that because they want them to then stay in the US and become, the next generation of brains who are going to push our field forward in STEM fields. Well, obviously that doesn't fit for international students who very likely will go home, right? So that's why they're not really generally don't fund fellowships for international students. Now, that doesn't mean that if you get a grant to do research from NSF or NIH or Department of Defense, you pay for students for research assistantship, but that's to do research on that project. That's a whole different thing. But this is for fellowships where they're just being paid to go to grad school, really, and obviously they're going to be doing research, but it's not they're not being paid for the job of doing research. Okay, this is not the case necessarily for industry, for professional organizations. So that's where you should guide your international students to look more into professional organizations, especially because they are more focused on the profession, whether it's in the US or elsewhere. Doesn't mean all professional association fellowships are open to anybody, but that is where you're usually most likely to find fellowships where international students would be eligible. Also, students should look to their home countries. So a lot of times there are fellowships available from their home country, either their government or from industry in the home country that want to support students who are going to come get a graduate degree in the US and then come back and work, in that country, work for that particular corporation. So that's really where they are most likely to be eligible. And of course, those departmental fellowships may be available for particularly for excellent students where the department really wants to entice them to come there. So examples of these are all kind of professional associations, foundations. So American Association of University Women has an international fellowship. The American Council of Learned Societies has the fellowships that are open to international students. American Heart Association, Pre-Doctoral Fellowship. So you can see none of these are federally funded. This is all, kind of, again, foundations, professional associations. This can be a little challenging, though, I have to say, when you're talking to your international students, because they can feel very frustrated because most of those fellowships, they are not going to be eligible for those big federal fellowships. There are a few that they are, but most of them they're not. And that's just, kind of a fact of life because of what the funder, in this case, the federal government, is trying to accomplish. Okay, and then there are, more fellowships from professional associations, societies. These tend to be smaller, but they still look really good on that, that student CV. And it's also can be very useful exercise having them write up their research and apply. So that's something you might want to encourage them depending on your field, obviously. So look at your professional societies in the field that your student and you and the student are in, and encourage them to apply there. There are some fellowships available. All right, and then there are a number of fellowships I mentioned really briefly earlier that require some sort of an internship or summer experience. So GEM this one is specifically for American Indian, African American, Hispanic students in STEM disciplines. It is supported by a consortium of industry, and they want the industry member, or they're only for member universities. I believe Prairie View is a member, and they will, basically the students can apply, and if they get a fellowship, they are expected to do internships at the member industry partners. Okay, so this is where it's part of the recruitment strategy for these companies, and the students get to know the companies get to know them, that kind of thing. Same thing, Department of Energy has a number of graduate fellowships. These usually require some sort of practicum in a DOE lab. Again, to help those students kind of get to know what DOE does, and they might want to hire them eventually. Okay. Now, in addition to fellowship, I just want to mention there are also kind of these other pot of kind of money to support students that are basically supplements and enhancement grants. So what those are is not a fellowship, in that they are not funding stipends just for, basically like a salary for the students to live off of. What those are for is to provide funding to help the students do their research. Okay, so that is where, for example, and this is particularly true for, like, for example, NSF in the social and behavioral sciences. They fund doctoral dissertation research improvement grants. So, for example, somebody might be a sociologist who needs access to a big expensive database, or they may need travel funds to go to a study site. That's what these are for. They will fund that. They're not funding the stipend for the student. They're funding those kinds of things. But that can also be helpful for students who are in the situation where maybe they are being funded they're getting that stipend, but they need that money to help them actually do their research. They might look for some of these kinds of programs. All right, so if you're looking, kind of helping your student look for fellowships, the big thing is, this seems like there's a whole lot out there, but really they can start to kind of filter down based on eligibility requirements. So, first thing they should say is, okay, what disciplines does this fellowship fund? Do I fit that, discipline? What stages of graduate study does it fund? And then are there any other eligibility criteria that I need to, kind of to meet? And that a lot of times can help you filter them down. Then they can need to think about, is it realistic? Can I really be competitive for this fellowship? As I said, it is expected they have a pretty good GPA. Some funders are much, they put more emphasis on GPA than others. Department of Defense tends to put a lot of emphasis on GPA, which is sort of fits their culture. They're all about the numbers. Others are more interested sometimes in a diversity of, kind of essays and so forth. So you can sometimes find that out through the grapevine. But another thing you can look at is how many do they fund a year? So there are some fellowships programs where they only fund 2 or 3 or 4 a year. Unless they don't it's a very small, obscure fellowship program, that's probably going to be super competitive. And so you would really, kind of have to think about whether you would want to encourage your student to spend a lot of time applying for something where they don't give very many a year. Now, others, though, particularly if you're talking about a professional association, it's already kind of narrowed down who's going to apply. And then if they give a reasonable number out a year, maybe they give 10 out, but it's only the, American Nutrition Society. Well, they're probably not going to get that many. So that might be kind of a more reasonable thing to think about, of encouraging a student to apply. Obviously, look at the review criteria. Okay, so a lot of times they will tell you, we're going to look at this, this, and this, and then you can kind of help the students you're mentoring to determine, is this reasonable? Can I really fit this? And then, of course, you got to look at when the application is due. So this is why, I think it's a good idea to really start thinking about encouraging your students to apply early, so that they will have more of an opportunity to catch those fellowships that maybe you're due in the fall. And they have time to write a strong application. All right, so if you're looking at potential fellowships, okay, so again, you want to look at all these things: what the eligibility, when's the application due, how many are awarded, do you apply through the university or as an individual? So generally the earlier career ones are much more individual. Some of the later career ones are more you apply through the institution, but it will vary. So that is an important thing to know, because if they're applying through the university, then there's going to be some more, kind of hoops they need to go through in order to get this all put together. Those tend to be a lot of times more where you're talking about actually co-applying with their faculty mentor. That's a lot of times where those kinds of fellowships tend to be more, where you apply through the university. Look at what is the funder trying to accomplish. Can I make the argument that, my being funded will help them accomplish that? What criteria are they using? What are the required components? So listing those components, and making sure, encourage that student to make a checklist so they don't forget things. I was surprised. I heard a program officer was talking about the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program, and they had a really significant percent of students who they never actually finished their application. And a lot of times the problem was they didn't have their letters of recommendation didn't come in. And so they just didn't even get, in the running. So making sure, kind of at least encouraging, mentoring your students to make a list, reach out for those folks who, who are controlling things they can't control, like writing letters of recommendation, and doing that early. Another thing, a lot of times students can be very shy about reaching out to the funders. So if there is any question about, well, I don't understand what they're looking for here, or I don't know, or even I'm just having trouble, there's a portal where I have to upload my application and I'm having trouble with it. Most of these funders are very, very helpful and very open to students. They understand this might be the first time a student's had to deal with a funding organization. And a lot of times they're very responsive. So I would definitely encourage the students you're mentoring to do that. I think it's also just a good thing to instill in them, is to be a little aggressive and reach out and not be intimidated. And that's especially true if they're planning to go to graduate school and perhaps go on into academia, is, to kind of be willing to put themselves out there and ask questions, even if we're talking about a big federal organization. All right. So when you're thinking about why is an organization funding a fellowship, explain to your student. I think a lot of times students aren't used to thinking about these kinds of applications from the funder's point of view. So they're just thinking, oh, well, here's somebody who's trying to give out money, right? And that's not why funders fund fellowships. They are funding it to achieve a particular organization's goals. So encourage them to really understand what those goals are, so that when they're writing their essays, when they're applying, they can kind of connect what they want to do and their career goals and their research goals with what the funder's trying to accomplish. Okay. Generally, a lot of times it may just be to encourage more students to get graduate degrees in a particular discipline. It might be to increase the number of qualified workers in a particular industry or particular field. It may be, a lot of them are to increase the diversity of the pool of people with graduate degrees in a particular field or industry. Okay. And then it may also be recruit future employees. So obviously, again, if you are going to be applying somewhere where it's clear they're trying to recruit future employees, you may want to, kind of talk about your interest in working for a company like that, right? That is going to be much more aligned with the goals of that funder than if they talk about, wanting to go work for NASA, something like that, and they're not applying for a NASA fellowship. So, you want to help that your students get their mind right before they write their application essays. Okay. So it is not about why the student needs money. Okay, so many students come at this from sort of the last time they had to write these essays was when they applied for college, and they are used to writing about, oh, this, me, this, and I have this need, and I have gone through all these difficult times and that kind of stuff, right? That's usually what you do in a college essay. That's not what you want to do in a fellowship. It's not about why you need money or why the student needs money, because everybody needs money, right? It's really about, again, how funding that student will help the funder achieve the goals. So a lot of times these students will need some real coaching in the style, the writing style, and the arguments they're making. And again, giving them a little coaching to help them understand this is not, oh, woe is me, I need money to go to grad school. It is, boy, I'm going to do great things that align with what you're interested in. This is why you want to fund me. Okay, so this all means you do need to understand your funder, have them plan their application. Okay, and if, obviously, hopefully you may be the person mentoring them. If they are maybe thinking about, so maybe you're talking to somebody who's an undergrad at Prairie View and they're thinking about going elsewhere for graduate school, you've kind of been mentoring them as an undergrad, encourage them also to reach out to wherever they're thinking about going and get a faculty mentor there. So you can mentor them, and then whoever they might want to work with and for their graduate degree should be very happy to mentor them, even if they haven't even committed. A lot of times faculty will do that because they know if they are, really helpful, that student is much more inclined to go there, right? If somebody is really willing to mentor them. Okay, and then make sure that student gets you to read lots of the drafts of their essays, but also get other people to read them. Make sure that they really are easy to follow, that they make the right arguments, and then encourage them to develop a schedule to kind of allow for lots of drafts. So again, sometimes students will see this more as writing an assignment for a class, in which case you do it the last minute and you put it in. This is not that. This means this requires a number of iterations. And I think this is where, if you have a number of students you're mentoring, get them to read each other's stuff, right? You don't have to do all the work. And obviously you're the one who really understands scholarly writing. You're the one who is going to be the ultimate arbiter, but a lot of times other students can point out when things don't make sense. And it makes them, kind of think about their own essays and their own applications from the point of view of the reader, not just their own point of view. So I think it can be, even forming writing groups can be helpful for the students. So a typical application, fellowship application, requires, of course, all the biographical information, maybe GRE scores and so forth. They're kind of going away from that, but some are requiring that. A transcript, letters of reference, and then the essays, or as you're getting farther along in your research career, or the students getting farther along, then more of a proposal. It might be an 8-page proposal or whatever, describing their research. Okay, so it might be essays, just a few pages, to a more of almost a mini proposal. Okay, where a lot of times these essays maybe involve discussion of the proposed research, maybe discussion of what they've done in the past, maybe the research experiences, they've done any undergrad research experiences, discussion of their goals, their career goals a lot of times will be in there. It can be other things depending on kind of what the funder is trying to do. So for example, the Ford Foundation is all about enhancing diversity of the professoriate. So they ask them about, how they try to make classrooms more inclusive, what their ideas are about with diversity, what have they done in the past, because that is part of what they're looking for. Okay, so I think I've already said this, that basically the earlier the student is in their career, those kinds of fellowships are usually shorter descriptions of the proposed research, because they may not even really quite be sure what they're going to do for their degree, for their graduate research, to much more detailed as you get kind of farther along, because obviously you should, if you're getting close to writing your dissertation, you should have a pretty good idea of what your research is about, and you should be able to explain that. Okay. And then, just have them kind of, again, develop that schedule. So as a faculty member, as I mentioned earlier, you could be the faculty advisor for a student who plans to do graduate research for you, in which case you can really help them with that research description. That again, it needs to come from them to some extent, but particularly if they're early in their careers, it's going to be a collaborative, kind of discussion, because they, particularly if they're a senior undergrad or they're very early in their graduate careers, they may still be trying to decide what they're going to do. And so you can kind of help them with that part of it. You may just be, maybe again, a mentor for them as an undergraduate. Okay, and they may even be going elsewhere, or they may be working with somebody else in their graduate studies, and that's particularly true if you're an advisor, for example, an undergraduate advisor. And so in that case, again, you can kind of give them a little more coaching, but you want to encourage them to find somebody who can be that research mentor, because they do need to have that somebody who can read the research description. And again, if they're early in their careers, obviously, again, if they're farther along in their careers, they've already got an advisor, that faculty advisor for their research should be helping them with this. Okay. If you're a graduate coordinator in the students department, again, help them, you can help them through the process, help them know what fellowships are out there, understand what the expectations are, help them with the process, encourage them to start early, but really emphasize to them they need to find a faculty mentor who's going to help them with the research part of it. And again, if they're early on, they don't have an advisor yet, this can be part of that process to get an advisor, but that advisor should be quite involved in helping them with the, and kind of giving them feedback, at least on their research plan. In general, a lot of times what you can do is provide advice on the research plan in general if you are their advisor, or even if you're not, you can critique their writing, because again, for most of these applications, they're expecting scholarly writing, and a lot of students, this may be their first time to write in a really scholarly way, and so this is something where they may need guidance. Okay. The other thing that they're going to have to do is get references. So, again, you can coach them on this. Tell them to make it easy for, their references to write a strong letter. Give them plenty of time. Explain, kind of in their request, remind them of what their relationship is. Oh, you maybe remember that, 2 years ago, I worked in your lab in the summer and I did XYZ. Or, you may remember I did a co-op in your, at your company and I helped with this and that, so give them all that stuff so that they can, kind of put that in the letter. The more specific the letter, the better. And then encourage your students to follow up with those references. Make sure that they do get, their letters in. Okay. And then, again, encourage them to write in a scholarly style, making it clear they understand what research is. This is, graduate school is about doing research. And so they need to be able to explain what they were going to do for their dissertation in a style that makes it clear they understand what research is, having clear hypotheses, goals, objectives, describing how their work fits into the state of the art, understanding the literature. All that will, a lot of times will be part of what the reviewer is looking for, not necessarily so much just specifically what the research is, but does this student understand, what they're doing, or are they just parroting what they've been told? Okay, that is really a big part of what they're looking for, is do they have those research skills and the skills to be successful? Okay, so examples. NSF, Graduate Research Fellowship Program. Okay, so this one, they give a stipend of $34,000 per year for 3 years. If the student gets one, they get an education allowance of about $12,000 a year. So that's, to help pay for computer, books, tuition, all that kind of stuff. Okay. And they have about a 16% success rate is the last I saw in terms of the published success rate. So that's not too bad. Okay. So when you're looking at what is NSF trying to accomplish, okay, they are trying to get more people to go into graduate school and go into research careers in STEM fields. Okay. And STEM includes social science, includes economics, there are a lot of fields that includes, not just physics and math, right? In order to be eligible, you have to be a U.S. citizen, national or permanent resident. And then you need to be early in your career, or your students do, right? So they can be senior undergraduate, they can be a first-year graduate student, or a second-year graduate student who has not finished that first semester. So this is meaning you need to be, you need to not have completed 18 months of graduate study. So you are more than 12 months of graduate study, I guess. Yeah. So you need to be in that second year, but have not completed the first semester of the second year. It's the latest you can do it. Okay. But the other thing is you can apply as an undergrad, but then you can apply only once as a graduate student. So people a lot of times will apply more than once, but you cannot apply on your undergrad first year and also second year. You can only apply once as a first year, second year graduate student. The way the reviewers will, kind of review these applications, particularly those research plans, are, calibrated to where that student is. So if they're an undergrad, they're not going to expect as much as somebody who is maybe in their second year of graduate school. So that is something, not your students that you're mentoring shouldn't be too intimidated by the idea of writing up an idea for a research project for their dissertation, even if they don't quite know what it is yet. Because again, what are the reviewers looking for? They are looking for, do you understand what research is? Can you describe a project? A lot of times particularly if they put something in as a senior in undergrad, they may not end up doing exactly what they described. Obviously, it needs to be in the same field, but this is all more about understanding, how the process works. They do not tend to fund, professional degrees. So somebody who's getting a counseling degree or dentist degree or MD, any of those things, that's not, NSF doesn't fund that. They are wanting to fund scientists, right? Future scientists, so MS and PhDs. Okay. So here are the fields as chemistry, computer information science, engineering, geo, life science, materials, math, physics, behavioral and social, and STEM education and learning research. Okay, so again, this is research, not a professional degree to become a teacher, but to do research in STEM education and learning, but not, as I said before, MBAs, MDs, and JDs, that kind of thing. Okay. And then to apply, you have a personal profile, that's that demographic information, personal background and future goals, which is 3 pages, graduate research plan, which is 2 pages, the transcript, and then 3 letters of reference. So this is not a huge, undertaking really when you look at it, but these essays, the personal background and future goals and the graduate research plan, this will require a number of drafts and again, coaching of the students so they understand what they're looking for. But there are a lot of resources, which I'm going to talk about next, that can help them write a strong essay. Okay. In order to be competitive, they do need to have pretty good grades. So typically 3.7 or higher. So, if you have a student who doesn't have a stellar GPA, they're 3.2, probably don't, they're not going to be competitive for this particular fellowship. This is really, you want to focus on those students who have a pretty good GPA. Having an undergraduate research experience of some kind is important. Now, the way you define that can be pretty flexible, but this is why it is so important to mentor students and to encourage them to go into undergraduate research, if they're thinking about going on to graduate school, because that is something NSF is going to be looking for. Do you understand what research is? Did you enjoy it, right? If you don't even understand what research is, are you likely to really be successful in graduate school where that's what it's all about? So now that could be an internship at a company, could be a co-op. It doesn't have to be a formal research experience, but it does need to be something that they can describe what they were trying to find out, what they learned, and that they can kind of demonstrate their skills in doing research. That personal statement, all of and a strong research proposal are all important. Okay. All right. So as for anything going to NSF, they look at intellectual merit. Okay. So what are you going to learn? Broader impacts. How does this benefit society? And so for any of these essays, they will be looking at both of those things when they're reviewing them. Okay. And then, as they're writing their proposed plan of research, they're looking for, do you have a plan, right? Does your student have a plan, okay, for what they're going to do? And can they describe it in a way that it makes it clear they understand how research is done, they understand methodology, they've looked at the literature. All of that stuff is important. And we're not talking big, long thing. This is only 2 pages, right? So, but can they describe what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, why it's important, what they're going to learn. All those kinds of things are part of, again, impressing that reviewer with, with their abilities, their understanding of the research process, and making the argument they're likely to be successful. Okay. And then the more, I'm not going to kind of go through all these, but just again, this can be helpful. You can go through this with your students as they're developing their research statement of describing, again, the topic, the hypothesis, and so forth. Okay. For the personal statement, this is they're asking, so why do you want to go to grad school, right? What is your career? How do you envision your career? What are your personal, and educational professional experiences that motivate your decision to go into advanced study in STEM, right? These are all part of, is this somebody who's really going to be passionate about going to graduate school? Are they going to stick it out, right? That's part of what NSF is looking for. Are they going to be strong researchers when they get through this? That is something they're going to look for. Now, NSF is really all about broadening participation. So again, being in HBCU, your students, if they're, if they're African American, if they're Hispanic, if they're from any kind of underrepresented group in STEM, that should come through in their, obviously they will put that in their demographic information, but it should come through in their essays too, about how that, how is it that may have impacted their experiences, impacted their decisions, their goals, and so forth. That is something that's really important to NSF. And so they shouldn't shy away from that at all. Okay. And then describing their research experiences. Again, this is all about showing they understand how research is done. They can describe what they were doing, not just, hey, I was washing bottles in the lab. I understand, even if that's what they were doing, what was the larger project they were working on? Okay. All right, so there are a lot of helpful websites out there, so that for the GRFP, because it's such a big program, and so these are some really good resources with lots of sample essays. Also, if you go to the link that I gave you in the chat, I posted some sample essays that I thought were especially good. So you can let those students look at those and they kind of see the style that those are written in. All right, and then just the other one is the Ford Foundation. This one is more open to, this is not just STEM. In fact, they fund a lot of stuff in the humanities and so forth. But what they're looking for is people who want to go into the professoriate, who want to be faculty, okay? Because what they're trying to do is diversify faculty. So they want people who are underrepresented. So generally African American, Hispanic, Native American, so forth, right? But they want them though to be committed to the, kind of promoting a more inclusive classroom and so forth. They also have essays. These are double spaced. So the other ones were single space for NSF. These are double spaced. So you're not talking about a ton of room. So that's a challenge a lot of times with these. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go through this. We're running out of time, but this is again for you to use as a resource when you're talking to students. The nice thing about the Ford Foundation is that they have a pre-doctoral, dissertation, and postdoctoral grants. So that can be super helpful because they can actually apply as they go along. And if they don't get the pre-doctoral, they can still, when they get to the dissertation grant stage, they can apply to that one. And or if they get the pre-doctoral, they can also apply when they get to that dissertation stage and then to the postdoctoral. So it can be a great, depending on where you are in or your student is in their careers, they can be eligible for one of these. Okay, and so this is more on the humanities side, some help resources on the art of writing proposals, resources for writing the Ford Foundation, for the Ford Foundation applications. So all of that, again, is something you can push your students, kind of to look into, and that there are a lot of things to help them if they know where to look. All right, does anybody have any questions? All right, well, I hope that this is helpful, and as you work with your students, encourage them to apply for these fellowships, that they'll find some of these resources helpful to them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you again, Lucy, for all of the information that you've shared with us throughout this series. Thank you, Dr. Green, for putting this together for us, and we thank you to everyone who is watching today, and this will be available on our YouTube channel which is PVAMU Research and Innovation. We encourage you to subscribe so that you always have access to the latest information whenever we post a video. There is a survey in the chat box, and we encourage everyone to complete the survey, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.
Okay,
Have a great day.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.